Сьогодні ми починаємо, далі продовжуємо цикл наших розмов по п'ятниці ввечері. І нашим гостем сьогодні є отець, ну, ще не отець, і подіякон Платон Бойко. So we continue our conversations today on Friday nights. And today our guest is Subdeacon Platon Boyko, who is doing his doctorate in religious studies and politics, kind of crossbreed between those two subjects. And we're going to be talking today about a very interesting topic, and that is a topic of Homo Sovieticus, or rather, the impact of the Soviet Union on mindset of people. And it is an interesting topic because it had impacted many of us, those who were born in the Soviet Union, and keeps impacting lots of decisions and politics that are made in Ukraine. And also impacted the psyche of lots of people who come from there, despite the fact that Ukraine had been independent already for 25 years. As as I just mentioned before in many other previous programs, you know that. Please let us know which language you would prefer us to speak, English or Ukrainian, and we'll try to facilitate that conversation for you. Without further ado, I'll ask Subdeacon Platon to our presentation. However, we just will do the prayer first. Я тільки хотів сказати знову ж таки ще раз, якщо у вас якісь є запитання, то дайте, будь ласка, давайте нам знати. І так само прохання є, дайте знати, якою мовою ви бажаєте, щоб ми розмовляли. Почнемо з нашої молитви. Царю Небесний, втішителю душі істини, що всюди єси і все наповняєш, скарби добра і життя подателю, прийди і вселися в нас, і очисти нас від всякої скверни, і спаси благі душі наші. Слава Отцю і Сину Святому Духу, нині повсякчас, на віки віків. Амінь. Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи благослови нас. Сам Господи прийди, поблагослови нас, осени нас Твоїм розумом, благодаттю і навчи нас чогось нового, щоб ми пізнали під час цієї лекції, дай нам доброту та милосердя в нашому житті. Амінь. Отже, і подякуване, собрате Платоне, я тільки хотів попросити спочатку, щоб ти розповів декілька слів про себе. I'm asking if you can just say a couple of words about yourself, where you're from, and what's the topic of your research, or interest of your research, and what's your educational background.
Well, my educational background is in theology and political science. I began with a bachelor's degree in theology at St. Andrews College in Winnipeg, and then studied international relations, political science, and recently, just a couple of years ago, completed my master's studies in political science, specializing in hybrid warfare. I was specifically interested in seeing what's happening in today's world, how the kinetic force of regular weaponry was replaced with all sorts of informational and psychological weaponry, basically to affect people's minds, to affect how they think, in order to gain its interests. And right now, I decided to fuse these two fields and study the role of religion in today's world. I was specifically attracted by the famous phrase coined by late Friedrich Nietzsche that claimed that God is dead, and he did it in basically in the beginning of the 20th century. I believe it was 1890 something year. And as I looked closer into Nietzsche, I realized that he himself was not an atheist. He was not a militant atheist. So I wondered why and how he would come up with such a shocking notion of the death of God. And basically, I came to a conclusion that he, being a philosopher, a true philosopher, he felt the time, the spirit of times. And after his declaration of God, of the death of God, we saw how difficult, how merciless the 20th century was, with its two world wars, with mass murder of people, with Holocaust. So we can say that he was he saw something. He definitely diagnosed the state of a human society rather correctly. But if you take this his concept of death of God further, I would actually claim that we're not talking about the death of God, because the phrase itself does not make any sense. If we believe in God, anywhere close as a Christian, as Christians believe, uh, the phrase that God is death is meaningless. So we can see, or we can view Nietzsche's approach as a constatation of the fact that humans decided to shut down the windows into the heavenly reality. They decided to cut their connection to God, and that's how God became dead for them. And since they cut that link, they felt that they're the center of the world, each one personally, and that's why all that there is in life is the material goods, all the possible fun that a person can have, and the goods. And so the point is to accumulate that. And since there is not enough for everybody, a human being would be willing uh, to gain that at the expense of others. That's how uh, the societies, how the relations with people um, become even less friendly, as they could have been. And just to kind of finalize this notion, uh, I was surprised to learn that notion of Nietzsche, that God is dead, it didn't just stop there. Basically, in the United States, in the years of 1960s, it's when the time of that free love, of marijuana,
The hippie
of
movement.
the hippie movement began, the anti-war movement began. This death of theology gained an impetus, a strong impetus. And you might be surprised, but there are quite a few serious scholars. Among them is recently retired Professor Altitzer, Thomas Altitzer, who is basically teaching that God is distant. That even if there is God, he is preoccupied with his own affairs, and he has nothing to do with people. There are different branches of that political theology, so to speak. One of the recent additions to this it's called a radical theology. But again, you see, what is interesting about this whole thing is that we are not talking about atheists per se. These are not people that clearly and plainly deny God. It's paradoxical. It's highly paradoxical. But this whole area is called radical theology, radical political theology, And there is a recent addition to that movement. There is a scholar whose name is Jordan Miller, and he wrote a book, Political Theology, Furious Hope, or Resisting Theology, Furious Hope. He calls his branch of radical theology as a resisting theology. And he claims that in all political movements that are present, and he begins with the Arab Spring, and he talks about Occupy Wall Street, and he talks about ACT UP movement in Canada, basically a political resisting movement. He calls it, he tries to find theological underpinnings in that movement. Because from the point of view of radical theology, God is not intervening, but people, and people have, because God is not intervening in the affairs of people on earth. That gives people an ample opportunity to practice their faith. Paradoxically, Miller goes so far as to say that a perfect religious community would be a community without any reference to God at all whatsoever. So just to help you to make sense out of it, for him, theology, he's talking about theology without God, per se. For him, theology is everything that affirms life. And so if he sees some kind of a protest movement of native people that are protesting against the decision to drill and destroy their pure water supply, he would call it a theological action, because people, it's a life-affirming action. People are standing for their lives, basically for the access to clean water. So there's ultimately, to summarize once again, is to say that neoliberalism, capitalism in its neoliberalist incarnation as we live it, it placed God in God became a private affair of every citizen. If before Nietzsche, before the 20th century, 17th century, let's say, God was present in public discourse, it was as if all sorts of agreements, all sorts of important life
Public mentionings, yes.
Yes, it was as if God was present there, and people realized somebody took it more seriously, somebody less, but still there was a sense that God is a witness, that God is with us, and that opened up and perhaps made people in a way more conscientious and more responsible in what they were doing. But ever since the death of God occurred, as per Nietzsche, God disappeared from public discourse. In today's society, where we have people of different cultural backgrounds, different faiths, it's not even allowed in many jurisdictions in North America, in Canada specifically, to be specifically theistic, to talk about religion. So ultimately, religion became a private affair from something of a public, something that embraced the public life, something that united societies, that created societies, created cultures. It withdrew faith, and God withdrew into individuals, each individual's life. So when radical theology is talking about theology as an affirmation of life, they are talking about still those inborn senses of what is good, what is right, what is wrong, that um, appears, that finds a way into reality as a resistance movement, like for Miller, for example. Um, so the question is, if is there, what kind of a future do we have if humanity cuts its connection to the divine? Is it possible to have some kind of a universally accepted um, values, ethical norms that would be practiced, and who would be enforcing them? A state? How effective would it be? Like, for example, today you can hear politicians of all sorts. Recently, well, a couple of months ago, I've seen the president of the Republic of France, French Republic, Mr. Macron. He was making a statement, and he was alluding to universal human values, and we hear it from our own politicians as well. And the question is, what are those universal human values? Uh, who uh, who approved them? Where did they come from? Um, Ultimately, we can see that they do appear to have their source in Christian ethics. But it is not politically correct to talk about this anymore. So the question is how. Well, there is an attempt. An ongoing attempt between representatives of different religions to engage in a serious dialogue that is not inter Christian dialogue, say Catholics and Orthodox. That has been ongoing, and there is history to that. But an interreligious dialogue, that is the monks and theologians from different, like Buddhism, Catholicism, get together.
Well, not just like Buddhism, Christianity, and other
Yes,
things.
specifically, yeah, these two I am aware of, and representative of Hinduism as well. They get together, and it kind of started late in the 19th century, and it gained a second kind of momentum in the middle of the 20th century. And one prominent representative of this movement, an advocate for it, was the late Father Thomas Merton, a famous Catholic monk who advocated it because he was. The idea is that every nation tries to has its own religion, because every nation, due to its own climate, to its own dispositions, they as they search for God, for higher meaning, they develop this religion. And there are mystics that see different religions as simply different windows that open our room to the higher reality. And there is yet another. If these radical political theologists are more on the political science side and less on the theological side proper, um, then there are still very interesting people like Raymond Panikkar, of Spanish and Indian origin, who passed away I believe in 2010, almost our contemporary, who was a Catholic priest, and yet he practiced Hinduism. He practiced meditation. he was a very prominent advocate for, well, you can't say world religion because that would be too heavy of a concept to bear, but at least some kind of a friendly understanding between people of different religions that ultimately we are when we are searching for transcendent, for the divine, we are searching for the same reality, but by different means and by different ways. So basically, that creates connections between people, and it kind of slightly even changes the tide of a neoliberal capitalism, where talking about religion is actually not very politically correct. And as a result, the newer generations are more interested um, in gadgets, in computer games, video games, than in reality. And it seems like we as humans are becoming less human when we lose touch with the divine. So this is a very interesting trend in itself, of how to bring God back, how to bring people back to God without forcing anybody or without uh, converting anybody to anything, but just even making people aware that there is higher reality and there is higher meaning. See, ultimately, the purpose of religion throughout centuries and millennia was to give senses, to give meaning. And now, a teenager, a student, a college student can find any sort of information within seconds on his smart device online. You ask him anything, he will be able to find an answer. The question is, first of all, is that person aware, is that student aware that anybody can post anything online and that not every source is trustworthy? Number one. But the biggest question is, okay, you can find an answer, you can find a formula, you can find an explanation for a physical phenomenon, but no science, no gadget, no internet will be able to give you a coherent vision of the world and of your place in it. So, religion, until it was chased out by people from the public sphere, and probably by many from the private sphere as well, uh, there is a gap. There is an abyss of meaninglessness, because you can find any sort of information on just about anything, and yet uh, you cannot make sense out of it in terms of the big picture. Why is it important that you know that? Why do you exist? What's your mission? What's the purpose? Um, Basically, that's what is lacking, with the lack of like pseudo, like totalitarian societies. We're supposed to be talking about Homo Sovieticus today. Totalitarian societies, take for example Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, they replaced religion with ideology that took place of religion. That's what gave people meaning, that's what united them, and that's what made possible those huge, horrendous crimes against humanity that these two regimes committed, because they were able to use ideology to coerce people into their cause, whatever, conquering lands or
So if I just may interject you, Sadiq.
absolutely, go ahead.
So it's interesting that you had mentioned we're now getting to this path of totalitarian regimes. One of them, which was the Soviet Union. So are you saying that the ideology, what was religious, was its moral values and certain values, especially Christian values in those societies, had been replaced with the ideological meanings, right? That were sold to people or imposed upon people, people convinced people in their validity, and then lived by people, and then kind of were propagated by the people of those countries.
Well, ultimately, the point of ideology is to unite people, and do it by making sure that these people are on the same page, that they have the same worldview. Then it's possible to harvest all that energy that can be created by united people. Uh, when we talk about Christianity, for example, it had its own difficult history pages, like religious wars, crusades, and the rest of it. But Christianity also created a culture. It basically the European Union, as we know it today, it's a product of Christian civilization, and North America is also a product of Christian civilization as an offspring.
Protestant civilization,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, well, mostly Protestant, yes, indeed, but there are also Orthodox, there are Catholics and stuff. It's Christian. So the United States is famous, and we all heard of Max Weber, a very interesting German sociologist and anthropologist of religion, who gave an ample presented an ample picture of how Protestantism built America as we know it today. So unlike ideology, what is like Protestant ethics is basically a life, a modest life, hard work, and highly moral life. So that's how, according to Max Weber, for example, the Americans in the beginning were able to accumulate enough capital because they were humble. They were not looking to spend what they earned through their hard work, and the hard work is a virtue in Protestant ethics. So they worked hard. They were able to make their life luxurious, but since living a luxurious life was rather a vice, they put the funds aside, and that's apparently how the initial capital that made possible the Industrial Revolution and rapid development of the United States was possible. So we can say that Christianity, in this sense, gave people more meaning to their lives, driven mostly and quite often to positive ends, um, um, unlike ideology, which almost initially is intended and designed to simply harness to unite people for some kind of a usually political purpose, to manipulate people. That's the key word here, ideology. But what we have in neoliberalism right now, and what is so highly problematic, what is creating difficulties for our democracies nowadays, is something that was placed at the center of this neoliberal capitalist system instead of God, and that is the liberal market. And this liberal market, and a number of highly respected scholars are talking about it, that this market, it's when it's unlimited, when it's not regulated, it creates monsters. It creates monster corporations that are able to coerce states. Some of them have uh, higher budgets than certain countries, and the with the idolization of a free market and money, money became became such an important player in the political process, even in the United States, which is oftentimes referred to as a exemplary democracy. Money has, though the accumulated huge capitals that were created as a result of that idealized market, is able to manipulate any democracy. And now we even have yet another threat, that is social media, that are able to influence heavily the democratic processes, who gets elected, who pays more for advertising, and so by removing God, if we connect the dots from our today's talk so far, we can say that by removing God from the political discourse, and inserting the free market and seeing it as a panacea, and the regulator, it will self-regulate, it will create prosperity. Well, we are now seeing that it's creating more disparity than prosperity, and more disparity means less stable society, less stable societies, and ultimately it's self-destructive. So here's an example of what happens when the that abyss, when that empty space that was created by taking God out of public life is yeah.
It's interesting that, like that I'm interrupting you right now at this point of time, and at the end of 18th, 19th century, beginning of 20th century, there was a Russian writer called Professor Vysheslavsky. So he was the one, and again, the same thought had been repeated by Father Chirovsky, that I had during this course, and that was a discussion about the Marxism itself, sorry that I'm bringing Marxism before you did, but it was interesting, that there is this, and even in our societies now at university milieu, quite often Marxism is seen as a romantic ideas, romanticized, how do you say it? Utopia, if you were to say it, And but Professor Vysheslavsky, and like I said, and Father Chirovsky repeated the same thing, and probably lots of other people would repeat the same thing, that what really is missing in the essence of romanticized Marxism, is that the issue of corruptibility of man, like what we have known from the beginning of the Bible, right? That we are created as free, right? Because of it created as free. Well, we talk about Adam and Eve, right? So they have created Adam had created possibility of man to make wrong choices, right? So being corrupt, basically, So what is missing in the Marxism in general, is how to deal with corruptibility, right? And how we are as a human beings quite often, even when I was studying during the Soviet times in Ukraine, we were always talking, idealizing the Soviet man, that we have such a strong morals and stuff like that, and within ourselves, within our mind, we were created that image that no, we talk about all of this idealism, and yet we see Communist Party leaders are the one that lived better, the one that steal more, the one that have better possessions, and if you, God forbid, you raise your hand and ask question, you're going to be punished more, like you're sent as a politically unstable person, or you can be pegged as somebody who is not reliable or not good in the Soviet society and stuff like that. So that was kind of interesting, that to discourse your discourse on the uh, on the issue of realism and stuff like that. So sorry that I interrupted you, but it was kind of very interesting, and I thought it was appropriate place to insert
No,
this.
no, by all means, thank you for this. It seems that you actually mentioned a very interesting notion about Marxism and neo-Marxism, and some say that claim that the contemporary European Union's constitution was written by a neo-Marxist, and that many problems of today's North American society were created by the neo-Marxists scholars. Um, this became especially this whole debate heated during the recent elections in the United States, where people were claiming that the Democrats, being leftists, almost Marxists, that they are for making everybody, for um, almost like being being communists, redistribution of wealth and stuff. And this is and the rights represented by the Republicans, they are kind of portrayed in the public discourse as the keepers of that old good America, where your will, your character, your skills, and your hard work would make you would win you,
Prosperous.
yeah, prosperous, and will make you will realize your American dream. Now, this discourse is unfortunately extremely distorted because, first of all, the situation, the complex situations in the United States that became so obvious during the last election campaign, uh, it was created ultimately by both parties, because it wasn't one party in power all this time, and then all of a sudden the problem appeared. That's number one. Number two, it would be a mistake to simply claim that less regulation. People don't like governmental regulation, and it's understandable. But in today's world, when the laws, the lawmakers, the legislature of any given state almost is not keeping pace with the technological advances, and when this inequality and disparity creates ruptures in societies, um, we cannot continue to talk, to engage in this right versus left debate, or Marxists or Democrats, Democratic versus Republican, Protestant, Christian. It's a wrong system of coordinates, because the reality in which we live is not the reality of the 19th or 18th century in North America. So uh, the reality is such that disparity, technology, and the huge accumulation of wealth is threatening the existence of this of our way of life in today's neoliberal capitalist democracy as we know it. It's interesting to note that in the 30s, uh, when the Democrats and Republicans were debating during between the elections, you know what they were talking about? It was the time when the first huge corporations were popping up, and with huge corporation, the huge accumulation of wealth, and thus of power. That's when the banks, powerful banks, were appearing even before the 30s, like let's say, early 20th century. So the debate between Democrats and Republicans was about how to regulate this this accumulation, that this concentration of power and wealth, so that it does not endanger the people, so that it does not become a sovereign that will actually dictate how people live. And ultimately, as we see largely, this the Democrats and Republicans in those days, they saw different ways of dealing with the problem, but we can probably say that they didn't succeed much, really. Neither Democrats nor Republicans, because we do see huge disparity, especially in the United States. On the one hand, it's
If
yeah.
if
Go ahead.
if I just may mention, our good friend Father Cyril Havorun talked about it from a little bit different perspective on democratics and versus on liberalism versus conservatism, if you were to say it.
Mhm.
So he talked about a different view of sin. How how the liberalism and conservatism lays its roots in the notion of what the human being is and what sin is. So he's saying that the basically the notion of conservatism, is that laying in the St. Augustine, even, like if you were to say it, where man is inherited that chip, and that he is there to sin and he needs to be corrected, And then he talked about the liberal notion is that comes from the standpoint that man, out of his own goodwill, out of his own inner connection to God, can fix his own deeds, his own bad deeds, under the influence of good church and society and stuff like that. So punishment versus good faith and human being and stuff like that. And those two ideologies, based on that religious roots, of course, had developed into a different and more sophisticated, very sophisticated streams, and very different flavors all across the globe. But basically, that's where he argued that the origin of that had laid. Um, my I wanted to call you Father Deacon, but you're subdeacon, so far. Platon and I had studied at St. Andrew's College yet a while ago, and I just wanted to remind to those who are watching, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. My big thing was that I wanted to talk about, and perhaps we don't really have much time left, is that to talk about what Homo Sovieticus is. So I again, it had been talked about quite a few times, and the first reference to that was in Alexander Zinoviev's book, which is called sarcastically is Homo Sovieticus. So definition of that was that Homo Sovieticus is a sarcastic and critical reference to an average conformist person in the Soviet Union and other countries of Eastern Bloc, which is Warsaw Bloc for that matter. And I would say that Homo Sovieticus is that notion had been developed not only in the post-Soviet blocs, those countries of the Warsaw Bloc, for that matter, or Warsaw Bloc, and including Yugoslavia and stuff like that, but also in any other country that had developed communist ideology as its own ideology. So the term was popularized in Soviet writer and sociologist Alexander Zinoviev, and in book which was called in the same time Homo Sovieticus. Homo Sovieticus comes from the Latin word, from Latin Soviet man, right? Homos, and Sovieticus, Soviet man, a sarcastic and critical reference to an average conformist person, right? Once again, conformist person in the Soviet Union and other countries of Eastern Bloc. The term that was popularized by Alexander Zinoviev also portrayed its deep roots of the Soviet ideology and how it lays its seeds in the people, and how hard it is for us to get rid of that. And if we have time at the very end of our conversation in about 10 minutes, I also would like to make the reference about Homo Sovieticus in the about book of Numbers that our good friend Volodymyr Rybinchak had discovered in one of the rabbinical writings, for that matter. So, okay, so go ahead. Sorry, Siddiq, I interrupted you so abruptly, but I just kind of wanted to mention this because it's a very important topic and kind of lays. You had made it a really good outline of for a conversation, actually. Going to Nietzsche and other philosophers, but please continue this because I think it's a very interesting topic, judging by the number of people who are viewing. And once again, please, if you have any questions, please do so. Type them in, and we'll be able to answer them. If you do not have questions, I'll ask Subdeacon Platon. I just wanted to, I mean, you made in my books to the deacon, so. Okay. Go ahead, sorry.
All right. In terms of Homo Sovieticus, well, I checked it out just to see if Encyclopedia Britannica has anything to say about it, and none. It has nothing to say. Wikipedia always obviously does, but Wikipedia is never taken, and it's not allowed in a scholarly research. So we can say that this is not a strictly scholarly term. It's more of a folk kind of a folklore term that is used to describe probably the more of a negative aspect of citizens of the former Soviet Union. And well, if we're talking about the negative aspects, yes, it is conformism, but it would be a mistake to think that these people are simple conformists. The Soviet Union made life such that if you wanted to survive, you needed to at least pretend that you buy into the official ideology. And as you know, in the late Soviet Union, people during the daytime at work, they would go to party meetings and talk all sorts of nonsense, and then they will come back home and laugh about it or sitting by their kitchen table and having an evening tea. That's a common thing, and sharing anecdotes about Chairman Brezhnev or the like. So there is the Homo Sovieticus. It's a human being that has multiple dimensions. At first, it is by the conditions imposed on it. It needed to adopt, to pretend, or to take seriously in many cases the official ideology so as to survive and build a career even. And on the other hand, even specifically closer to the end of the Soviet Union, more and more people were just laughing at it and seeing that this system is just not sustainable, that it cannot exist much longer. But if we're talking about you mentioned that people that lived in the Soviet Union, they're dealing with the effects of being a Homo Sovieticus even in the free world. So we're talking about the consequences of being Homo Sovieticus, and so what was especially damaging about that system was the fear that it instilled in people, the fear by mass killings, by night raids that took away people that never came back and were shot in the woods, by Holodomor in Ukraine, by horrible forced starvation of millions of people. And this fear, some say that it's actually is transmitted almost genetically. So there is that fear, specifically against the state, a deep distrust into this to the state. That is something that Homo Sovieticus, as a former Soviet citizen, definitely carries inside of him or herself. Um,
If I just may add, that fear is the phobia. Actually, it's not only like just a fear; it's a phobia because it's almost like you feel there's always somebody watching on the back, you know. And now we look at the modern Russian society, you know, and it almost feels like, you know, that veneration of Putin, if you were to say it, you know. So it's almost like he is watching everybody personally, their comments, their walks, and stuff like that, you know. So it's that fear of the top. And if you read the Father Georgy Chistakov, you know, his writings, like he was a really bright man, you know, Царство ему небесное. He talked about the and even Schmann's writings, you know, in his history of the Russia, historical road of the Orthodox Church, you know, he talks about the captivity, the fear of the Tsar, of the emperor, of the ruler, you know, and believe in faith in that merciful guy and stuff like that, you know. And unfortunately, that had came and passed in the Soviet society, even from generation to generation. And then from this emperor comes the Communist Party leader who is dictator. But you know, there's still that belief that, oh, he can be good, you know, but he does so much good there, you know. And then of course passed from the legacy of the Soviet Union again next to the next generation, you know.
you know what is interesting, Father Ihor? It's we can actually expand the notion of Homo Sovieticus. It's not specifically peculiar to the Soviet Union as it is, because it has its roots in Russian culture. Russia is a very interesting country. If you look at its history, there were some of the richest men in Russia could lose all their wealth in a moment and become nobody and die in the middle of the field, uh, because there was always a, there was a strong sovereign. There was an emperor. There was a czar, and anybody else who is like Ivan the Terrible is known to write to, I believe it was the British princess. He said, "Who are you at all? You are not even able to punish your subjects to death, whereas I can do whatever I want with my subjects." So this culture of this fear, um, uh, this uh, trait of character of adopting to authority is deeply rooted not only in the Soviet Union but in Russia. Like some of these people that were the richest persons in Europe. Particular names escape me at the moment. I think maybe Menshikov, or I'm not sure, but at least there were a couple of such people that were favorites of the royal court. They had incredible wealth, and then all of a sudden they were accused of something. They were found unloyal. They lost everything, and one of them died on a piece of cloth in a cold on a cold day, just in a plain field. Yesterday he was the richest person in Europe, and today he's just a corpse without anything, lying in the field. So this dependence on higher authority. There is a well-known saying in Russian, "Я начальник, ты дурак," meaning I'm a boss and you're a fool. Um, it comes from those times. That's why, as you said, the initiative was so dangerous. You were talking about the Soviet period, that you did not want to stand out and say something because you'll be punished. But it was also true for the imperial times. So this is a long-standing kind of cultural cultural trait.
Talking about the notion of Homo Sovieticus and stuff like that, and how again it needs to be further explored, and hopefully, judging by the number of people watching, probably needs to be talked a little bit more about this. But the whole point of it is that when you look and refer to at the what Volodya, what our good friend at Bible Studies, Volodymyr, have done, he quoted rabbinical writing in Book of Exodus, actually Book of Exodus, or was it? I'm not quite sure if it's Book of Numbers or Exodus, one of those two books. Maybe it's even Book of Numbers. So he talked about a very interesting thing, that we as people who come from that area need to understand and perhaps appreciate in transforming from a post-Soviet society to a new democratic society. So he talked about Moses, who wandered in the desert for 40 years, right? And in those 40 years, there was lots of lapses, like back to, oh, we would like to go back and stuff like that. So, and a couple of points had been mentioned. Point number one was a romantic notion of the past. We when you look at the Donbass, for instance, the war there and stuff like that, and many other occurrences, and especially people who even come to Canada here to live with their kids, but of my parents' generation, perhaps a little bit younger, to romantically talk about the Soviet Union. Oh, it was so good. It was a land of milk and honey, and it was just, so great and stuff like that. And again, the parallel could be drawn to what Volodya had discovered, and he said, that romantic notion, our part of our mindset or psyche, is to remember only good things that happened in the past, right?
Well, that's one.
So
That's
Israelites, those who were in the desert, who were going under the burning sun, to go to the promised land, which promised land, it means more than just a physical location, of course, promised land, that were given God this manna from the heaven, where they remember it, and one of those moments is that they complained to Moses, saying, Moses, listen, we had two types of onions there in Israel, in Egypt, we just have to eat manna here. Like, what's going on, man? Like, you promised us the land of milk and honey. So the first thing is romantic notion. Romantic notion is always blind, and we tend to romanticize only one thing, what happened in the past, right? So that's number one. Number two is that coming from becoming slave to a free man, it takes time and it takes effort to work upon yourself. Otherwise, you will be enslaved for the rest of your life, and your kids will be slaves too, and so on and so forth. That's why going through the desert there for 40 years, remember that only two people entered the promised land that were born in Egypt, right? Jesus Navin, and there's one more person, that came in there. So again, that was because only free people who are reborn, who do not know the captivity, can enter the promised land. So it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes killing a slave within yourself. Destroying the slave within yourself. Be appreciative to God. And the third thing that he had mentioned, and again, it's a very beautiful thing too, is that the freedom does not necessarily guarantee a prosperity, right? So freedom, and that notion actually is a very interesting one, and especially applies to many of us who were born in the Soviet Union, who romanticized Western world. Oh, look at this, they have this and this and that, So all of a sudden, people were thinking, if you become free, independent Ukraine, right away, so we're gonna have this, everything basically, So no, it takes time to build an economy. It takes time to build society, lawful society, and I think, I don't know, I hope that in our lifetime we will live long enough to perhaps not to live the ideal, but to perhaps to reach out to that point where the lawful society is built in the countries of post-Soviet Union, including Ukraine. Because the roots of that Homo Sovieticism, if you were to say it, are very deep. The corruption is very much easier to accept than it is to accept freedom, truly freedom in God, truly become free people kind of thing. Sorry, I cannot monopolize the conversation. Go ahead.
No.
After
Okay, you touched upon three very interesting points, which can be uh, distilled down to two: romanticism of the past and freedom, the challenge of freedom. So, concerning romanticism of the past, the very well known Yale professor of history, Timothy Snyder, put it wonderfully. He says that people tend to romanticize. There was a sociological study done. People were basically asked what time was the best, what years were the best in their lives, and after analyzing data, it came out that people always voted for the time when they were 16, 18, 20, in their younger years. So that was the best time of their lives. So if it happens that a person lived at those ages in the Soviet Union, then it will automatically, you know, be juxtaposed on the Soviet system. So it is very subjective, and Professor Snyder was making that comment about the previous U.S. president's motto, "Make America Great Again." Because the question was, when was America great? And when the study was done, it came out that for every person, America was great when that person was young. So it's a manipulation. It has nothing to do with history or politics. Second thing about freedom, the challenge of freedom. It's it's one of those archetypal things, actually, and one of the reasons why people are so susceptible to to social media, to ideologies, and things alike, is because it's almost as if a human being wants to give its freedom to someone or something. If it's something, it can be career, it can be wealth. If someone, it can be a particular person, or something, it can be a particular concept. Because it, as you said, it takes it's not easy to be a responsible, free being, free human being. Because then you realize that you're responsible for the choices you're making, and the rest of it. It's much easier, and it takes. You have to live through all sorts of moral struggles. Uh, uh, a very simple situation, if you try to analyze it and to make a rational decision about it, uh, can be complex. What do you do in a particular situation? It's difficult to make choices. Sometimes people just hate to make choices. They just let things happen on their own, even though it's also a choice, not making a choice. So it's a heavy burden, and ultimately, I heard only a couple of days ago. I think some politician in Russia, I think, was decrying that, was putting down the freedom because it's actually a burden. It's we don't need freedom, and freedom does have a potentiality. It carries with it. It's uh, innate. A potentiality of a bad choice, a potentiality of degradation. So it's much easier to uh, give your freedom to something or somebody and then say, well, whatever happens, I'm not
responsible.
responsible for it. So and religion uh, was one of those vehicles um, that actually helped so much people to somehow to use it positively, or to realize that potential in a good way. But again, just to summarize, we are not calling to make to all of a sudden reintroduce religion and make everybody religious, or nothing of the kind. We're talking about the role as that religion played, and what has replaced religion in our today's society, and what consequences as a result we are facing.
If I just may add to this, it's interesting, that religion provides a moral compass, if you were to say it, right? If you live a living faith, if it's part of the essential being and so on, it provides you a moral compass. And I just remember one time that I was at a lecture. I think my father Maxim was reading it. It was at the Christ the Savior's Sobor. They had lectures about it, and somebody had asked, "What truly is a freedom? What is freedom, right?" And Father Maxim kind of interestingly said that freedom is life in Jesus Christ. For us as Christian, freedom is life in Jesus Christ. And right now, when we are on the road to Pascha during this great Lent, it kind of resembles, it gives us this opportunity to rethink about this notion.
Just to add a bit more juice to that, we can also mention St. Augustine, or Blessed Augustine, according to the Orthodox tradition, who said that love God and do whatever you will, because if you truly love God, then your moral compass is right, and you do not need to rationally analyze every decision that you are making, because your heart will be pointing with God's help to what is right, if you truly love God. So that's St. Augustine's notion of freedom.
Yeah. And St. Augustine, of course, was one of the most prolific writers, or at least because his writings had been preserved, we talk about him as prolific writings. And even though he introduced that notion of we are inherently chipped or stained, he still is considered to be a saint in Eastern Orthodox Church, even though we sometimes do not agree with that.
He's considered as I think we consider him as blessed, блаженный, not святый. So in the Catholic tradition, he is referred to as a saint, but the Orthodox, maybe not every Orthodox Church calls him blessed.
Yeah. Well, we are at the end of our conversation. Kind of just time to do the good ending to this. I wanted to thank Subdeacon Platon for coming today, for talking today. I do believe that the conversation was interesting, and I'm hoping that was hoping to get more prompts or more questions but we haven't. And I would like to thank those who watched and this discourse, this conversation, and hoping to bring you more interesting stuff in the weeks to come. В цей час ми будемо прощатися з вами. Хотів подякувати і подякувати Платону Бойкові за його чудову розмову, обширну розмову, до речі, і мені здається, що ця розмова ще не закінчується, а мала б продовжуватися далі. Тому, вибачте, я маю чихнути. І тому, ми будемо прощатися з вами сьогодні і до наступних наших зустрічей і в четвер, і в п'ятницю наступного тижня. Thank you everyone, and we would like to conclude it with prayers. Богородиця Діво, радуйся, благодатна Марія, Господь з тобою, благословена ти в жонах і благословений плід утроби твоєї. Бо ти породила Христа, Спаса душ наших. Слава Отцю і Сину, Святому Духу, нині повсякчас, на віки віків. Амінь. Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй, Господи помилуй. Господи благослови. Господи Ісусе Христе, Сину Бога живого, поблагослови нас цей вечір і день, що наступатиме, бо ти благословені, самі тобі славу силаємо, Отцю і Сину, Святому Духу, нині повсякчас, на віки вічні. Амінь. І добраніч усім. Дякуємо. Всім спаси Господи і до наступних зустрічей.